Welcome to another All Israel News Update. I'm Hanan Lishinsky, and today we're going to talk about the depolarization in the society that leads to incitement and to threats of violence against an elected leader. And if you think we're talking about the US, unfortunately, we are talking about Israel. And many of you who maybe love Israel and follow Israel would hope or think that this isn't a problem here as well. I would argue that this is a problem that we see across most of the Western countries and their societies at the moment, and Israel is no exception here. Now, the recent assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump in the US has, of course, brought this whole issue to the forefront again. And Israel's cabinet a few days ago held a 2-hour discussion on the issue of incitement against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here in Israel. So during this 2-hour discussion, the cabinet secretary played a video with footage showing different people saying very nasty things against Prime Minister Netanyahu, even directly threatening him with violence. Some of the details you can read in a recent story we wrote about this issue, but suffice it to say that there were direct threats of violence against Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, the context of this is important to note. In Israel, and our older audience members may remember this, personally I can't remember it from my personal memory, but in 1995, our Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. He was assassinated. Now, he was more on the left, and his murderer was a right-wing extremist who killed him over Rabin's plans for peace and the Oslo Accords at that time. One of the important phrases that came out of this time, of this period of trauma, of national trauma, was the phrase, "Incitement leads to actions." And that means that today in Israeli political discourse, there is a very high sensitivity to threats of violence against politicians, even though in general, there is a very high level of colorful language that you might not be used to, from for example, European countries. So there's a heightened sensitivity around this issue, especially surrounding public demonstrations, which are also very large compared to many European countries here in Israel. Now, another important wrinkle to notice regarding this whole issue of Rabin's assassination in '95 is that today's Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time was leading the opposition, the right-wing opposition at the time, and he was accused and is still being accused today of inciting against Rabin, which many are saying, or more left-leaning people are still saying, that this led directly to the assassination of Rabin. So when Netanyahu and his allies today claim incitement against him, this is something that is always being brought up. So now, almost 30 years later, we are in a very similar situation. We have large-scale protests in Israel, across Israel, in different cities across Israel. Tens of thousands of people are demonstrating against the Prime Minister, who 30 years ago was Rabin, and now today is Netanyahu, of course. But it is important to note that this phenomenon of very intense and very passionate protests against Netanyahu is not something that started because of the war right now. It's something that started years ago, and even before the short-lived Lapid and Bennett government. And the protests were re-energized when Netanyahu and his government introduced the judicial reform plans 2 years ago, and the protest basically reached a height that was rarely ever seen in Israeli history until then. And then when the war started, of course, the protests subsided somewhat and have now roared back, not to the full extent that they were before the war, but we see very passionate protests again and again. We see violent threats, we see incitement. It's important to note, of course, that this isn't the broad majority of the protesters, but it is a phenomenon that exists. Now, while the judicial reform plans of the government were the main energizing issue of the protests before the war, now, of course, everything is in the shadow of the war. So on the one side, the key demand of the protesters is for the government to resign, especially for Prime Minister Netanyahu to resign, over the war policy and the way they have pursued the war in Gaza. And on the other hand, maybe the main issue at the moment is the hostage deal and the negotiations toward a deal about the hostages and truce as well. Now, many of the protesters are claiming that Prime Minister Netanyahu is either prolonging the negotiations or his goal is to prevent a deal that would lead to a truce and a hostage deal for political purposes, just to stay in power. And this, of course, is one of the main points that gives rise to violent threats. Many of the protests are led by families of hostages, and they, of course, somewhat understandably are very upset about the whole issue and blaming the government for the fact that their loved ones are still in captivity in the Gaza Strip until today. Now, while most of these protests have remained peaceful and have remained lawful, with police coordinating most of the demonstrations, sometimes some of the protests have turned violent even after the main protest event was over. There are small groups of radicals trying to burst through police barricades and violently protest. Another more recent phenomenon is the blocking of traffic across Israel, mainly in Tel Aviv. Many protesters have taken to protesting on the street, blocking traffic, erecting barricades, and then sometimes clashing with police, who is trying to remove them from the highways, of course. Some have even set fire on the highway and blocking the roads even further. And on the other hand, this of course has given rise to claims of police brutality. Now, police brutality is something that we unfortunately have an issue in this country, which isn't only limited to left-wing demonstrations. The ultra-Orthodox community has for years now complained about police brutality in their demonstrations. Of course, Arab Israelis and Palestinians have protested against sometimes police brutality for decades, probably. And the same thing happens here. We saw very difficult pictures sometimes of policemen beating women, dragging young men, young women away from the street, from the blockade, which also shows a certain measure of helplessness in the face of these demonstrations that are happening. You have to remember, for years now, almost every week, every day in some locations. So in the face of these weekly demonstrations, many ministers and Knesset members of the government have publicly slammed the police and slammed the judicial system for not being able to prevent these violent clashes, these violent protests, these threats that we have been seeing. Also, after this cabinet meeting that was held earlier this week, even the justice minister claimed that the judicial system is not acting according to his orders and is not taking the appropriate measures to prevent threats and even prevent what we have seen sometimes bursting through police barricades. This happened in Jerusalem a couple of times, where radical elements from within the protest movements burst through barricades and approached the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. So this is an ongoing issue, and this, of course, has also led to more political discussions and controversy, where one side is saying that not enough is being done to keep the Prime Minister safe, and many in the opposition are saying the Prime Minister is using and exploiting this issue to garner more support and to slam his opposition and the protest movement, which is protesting against his policies, of course. Now, of course, the media space is another major arena of this whole controversy, of this whole struggle. Most of the print and the news media in Israel is more left-leaning than right-leaning, so many are taking the positions or reflecting the positions of the protest movement, while there is also a struggle about the nature and the reasons for the protests in the first place. Now, among the Jewish people, there is a joke or a sentence that says that where there are two Jews, there are three opinions. The Jewish people and Israel, whoever knows Israel knows this. It's a very contentious society, a society that loves to fight, loves to argue. But even without the war, I think, to be honest, Israel and Israeli society is in a very difficult place at the moment. As we said at the outset, it's deeply polarized, it's deeply split. Now, the war has brought some unity, especially around the fighting itself, and many journalists who have visited the troops on the front lines have reiterated this again and again, that the soldiers on the front lines are united, that they're united in their common struggle in this important and just war. But on the home front, society continues to drift apart around political issues. And many are asking if after this war, after this whole issue is over, and remember in the north there's a potential second war looming, but after this whole issue is over, maybe Israeli society and Israeli politics especially needs a new start to open a new chapter and somehow find back together. And this is something that goes for most Western countries at the moment as well, even for the US, as we saw with the assassination attempt. So visit us on allisrael.com if you want more updates about this issue and all the other issues concerning Israeli society and politics. Visit us on allisrael.com and our social media channels.